Thank you, Pastor Joe. What a blessing it's been to be here with you. And, it's, being here is, I would say it's so familiar. I was trying to, kind of grasp kind of the things I was sensing in worship. And the worship that you have here, I think is rare if you don't realize. It's both very reverent, but welcoming. It's also very honoring of God. But intimate. When I tried to figure out, where did I feel this before, I realized, this is what I sensed often when Pastor Eddie actually would lead worship. That's the feelings I got, when I would enter into worship as he was leading. And that's what I sense here, that footprint, that legacy. It's incredible. It's an incredible place. And there are churches where the preaching has to carry the worship. I don't often like to go to those churches. There are churches where the worship carries the preaching. And I think that's what you have here. The worship carries the preaching. The preaching is just an extension of that worship. And so grateful, obviously, for the worship team and all their work, but also for this congregation that worships in such a way that invites the presence of God. And so, I feel renewed and refreshed. Oftentimes after a retreat, you feel worn out, but I feel like, man, I'm ready, right? I'm ready to go tackle the world and go back to East Bay, I think. I'm not sure. This morning, we're going to do a little pivot. And, I thought about, how can we kind of land this ship and where can we what message can we take home? And I think logically, I thought, okay, we can talk about what it means to rest in the Lord, cycles of Sabbath. But I think relationally, I think it makes more sense to talk about the heart of our Father and how He carries us as a man carries his son, especially when we feel like our strength is depleted. Right? Because we will not always feel like our strength is being renewed. And in those seasons, God does carry us like a man would carry his son during times of trouble. And so, having said that, I think it's appropriate that we begin with some dad jokes. And so, I know I'm a dad, so let's get to it, right? What did the baby otter say to his dad on Father's Day? You're a dad like no otter. All right, you guys get it, right? How do baby pigs celebrate on Father's Day? With lots of hugs and kisses. Oh, so cute, right? Maybe this isn't a dad joke, but maybe one that will hit home. One little boy was asked, "What is the difference between Father's Day and Mother's Day?" He thought about it, quickly replied, "They're basically the same thing, but you get to spend less money on Father's Day," right? And how many of us have felt that? Dads in here, right? And I think sometimes there's a lot of truth in our jokes, and it's interesting, isn't it, that there is a whole category of humor that's reserved just for dads. And I guess moms, no mom jokes, I guess, right? Moms don't tell as many jokes, or maybe they're more serious. I'm not sure, but I think I like these jokes, and periodically my wife will ask me, "How old are you?" Right? How old are you? Maybe it's just me, but as I think about dad jokes, I think everyone appreciates a good dad joke every once in a while, no matter what your experience was, right, in terms of your own personal relationship with your dad. And maybe your father wasn't that funny, maybe he was a little more serious, but I think there's a part of us that wants a father that's a little lighthearted, right, that's approachable, accessible. And I think when we think about God, right, we often don't think of Him in that light. But think of the one who created our capacity to laugh, to enjoy the light moments of life, to feel warmth. And there is a part of God that is that way as well, right? That puts a smile on our face and carries us and loves us tenderly. And so, this morning in this message, I hope that you'll be reminded of that. And, it's been said that people project their relationship with their parents onto God. And I think that's something I do often because I often see my Father in heaven as maybe being stern, maybe being demanding. And I often see God in that light. And I have to constantly remind myself that may be one aspect of God, right? His justice, right? His discipline. But there's a whole nother side of him, right? That is incredibly inviting and warm and loving and tender to us. And so on a day like today, I think we can be reminded of that. And so with that in mind, let's turn to Deuteronomy 1, verses 30 through 33. This is the word of the Lord. The Lord your God, who goes before you, will himself fight for you, just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes and in the wilderness, where you have seen how the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son, all the way that you went until you came into this place. Yet in spite of this word, you did not believe the Lord your God, who went before you in the way to seek you out a place to pitch your tents, in fire by night and in the cloud by day, to show you by what way you should go. Amen. Out of all the religions that are out there, Christianity does set itself apart in a number of ways. But one of the most significant differences is the fact that it is the only faith that refers to God as our Father, right? Have you ever thought about that? The only religion out of all the world religions that calls God our Father. Very intimate, very personal. And the Judeo-Christian view of God is largely predicated on relating to God as this good, loving Father to us. And here we see it more symbolic in terms of his action towards his own people. And like any good parent, three things. First is that God, he fights for us, right? He fights on our behalf. Second, he guides us. And third, he carries us like a man would carry his own son. And we'll take a closer look at how God parents us in these practical ways. But before we get to that, I do want to build this message on two important principles. The first is that God is the parent that we all desire deep in our hearts, the ideal parent that we all long for. Second, a living relationship with the God of the Bible transforms us into his perfection. And I would add on this Father's Day, it makes us the best parents that we can possibly be for our children. Those of you who are new parents, right? That's good news. You are being perfected into the best parent that you can be, if you fall into his image. And, let me just give you a quick example of why this might be true if you're not convinced. Anyone who is a, halfway decent parent understands that children thrive under consistent routine. And I think all parents would agree with that. And some are like rabid, like sleep training experts, right? Kids have to be in bed by 7, take their nap at 11, and you cannot deviate from that, right? Unless it's for prayer meetings, right? And so you understand why is that important? Why are these set behavior patterns, routines so important for your children? It's so that they know what to expect. And when you try to deviate from these expected norms, you firmly reinforce this decision because that's just what we do every single night, right? Unless there's an exception to it. And so you don't vacillate back and forth, let them sleep at 11 o'clock one night and then back to 7 the next night and randomize their sleep schedules. Why? Well, that would ensure a very cranky, unhappy, unhealthy child. And many times, as we discover these parenting tricks, we assume that we found some deep hidden secret, right? This is new, right? And secrets that no one knows through raising our children. And we fall in love with these methods. But often we don't ask the big question, the more important question of why. Why do my children need routine and consistency? In fact, why do I, as an adult, need routine and consistent patterns of life in order to flourish? And the simple answer is that this is deeply embedded in the human condition. And it's a desire for someone who will not change, right? Who loves us, who orders our lives, who cares for us, provides for our needs. And every day we can expect that person to be the same person to us and ensure that there is consistency and order to our lives. Because when our lives are ordered, right, we can thrive and grow and flourish and search for meaning and purpose. And it's nearly impossible for any human being to find any meaning to their lives when they're surrounded by chaos, right? I think we've all recognized that. When we're surrounded, when our lives are chaotic, we can't sit still enough to find meaning. And this is what we're providing for our children. And so when we think of the person that perfectly fulfills these needs, that's present for us in every breath that we take, it's no surprise that this describes the God that is revealed in his own word. Malachi 3:6, "For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed," right? By your passions, by the chaos of this world. Numbers 23:19, "God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should not change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it?" Understandably, it's impossible for us not to change as finite and sinful beings. And there are definitely things that we need to change as fallen creatures. But it's also easy, isn't it, to see a lot of the damage that volatile, ungodly change can have on our family relationships, on all relationships, actually. And when a father explodes in anger, when he is usually calm and quiet, well, that leaves lasting scars on the hearts of our children. But God, as our Father, he does not change. Right? He is slow to anger, abounding in love. And so his children, right, each and every one of us here, are never consumed by that anger, never consumed by his wrath. How many children, if you think about it, have been hurt by failed promises and what amounts in their eyes as lies? And maybe it is, even though it might be what we consider a change of mind. I had a friend who was told, and he recounts this like it happened, just yesterday, that his parents promised him a certain toy if he got straight A's, right? How many have you guys had those promises, right? Yeah, he had those same promises, but they failed, right? He did not get, the video game console when he got straight A's. And that incident, along with other failed promises, stuck with him into his adult life as he tried to figure out, why do I have so much hidden resentment against my father? They were good parents, right? But it's those lies, right, in his mind that were stacking up one at a time, as they promised him these things and did not come through. And again, our earthly parents can never fulfill all the things that they say to us, but we do have a Father in heaven who never fails to do what he says he will, right? His promises are sure and pure for us. And so we try to emulate that for our children, right? And we know it can't always happen, right? We know that we will fail, and there's probably apologies, necessary and needed, future when they understand these things. But it gives us a standard to live by, doesn't it? It gives us something to go after. And this is what is at stake as we learn how to imitate our Father in heaven, just as Jesus taught us. Be perfect, right? Be mature, as your Father in heaven is perfect and mature. And Paul, for this reason, he says, "I bow my knees before the Father," in Ephesians 3:14 through 15, "from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named." R.T. France, in his commentary, explains these verses in this way. He says, "And the more nearly any fatherhood, natural or spiritual, approaches in character to God's perfect fatherhood, the more truly does it manifest fatherhood as God intended it to be," right? As God, our Father, intended it to be. And in the context of the passage that we read in the book of Deuteronomy, all the miracles that God performed in Egypt was out of a desire to fight for his children, right? Going back to the first verse, to fight for us. The nation of Israel is referred to as God's own son in the Old Testament. Hosea 11:1, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Right? My child, come out of your bondage, come out of slavery. And like any good father should, God fought for the freedom of his children and did not allow them to be bound by the chains of injustice. And that is true today for us as well. And it gives us an example. And it tells us, and it proves to us what Paul says in Romans 8:31. If God is for us, who can be against us? Amen? If he is fighting for us, right, who can conquer us? Who can defeat us? And I realize that sometimes it can feel like everything is stacked up against you. But if you know that God is for you, you have the confidence to not only survive under those circumstances, but actually to grow and to flourish. And if you have the assurance that there is no circumstance that can defeat you or stand against you because you have this Father in heaven beside you, you no longer have to live in fear or anxiety or feel like you are the victim of chance. And to be clear, Paul isn't telling us that there won't be people and things to struggle against, but that in the end, there is no weapon formed against you that will flourish or prosper. And if you believe in your heart that God is for you, this enables you to live courageously and to take risks and to accomplish things, right, that you felt like was not possible. And in a sense, if you consider, right, we're also called, for the fathers in here and mothers, we're called to fight on behalf of our children. And this doesn't mean, at their Little League game, right? When they don't get their playing time, throwing down, right, against, the bad coach, right? But, fighting for our children, I think, requires a lot of wisdom on our parts as earthly parents. In middle school, our daughter wanted to start an after-school prayer club, and I remember this, but her principal did not allow it. Based on the fact that it was going to be Christian, right? And he allowed every other club during the pandemic, and I thought, yo, what gives, right? and I thought, Pastor Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, this is actually against the law, right? It constitutes religious discrimination. And so I got into fight mode as a father, and I told Mira, I'm going to sue this principal, this school district. I'm going to bring this whole thing down, right? It's all going down. Luckily, Mira's a woman of prayer, and she told me wisely, you know what, maybe that's not the best witness as a Christian. Maybe, just maybe that's not. Why don't we allow God to fight this battle for us? And I thought about it, and thought, all right, okay. Maybe you're right on this. Learned a very valuable lesson from my wife, and that is sometimes fighting on behalf of our children means teaching them that God is fighting for them, right? That God is ultimately fighting for them. And God did redeem, our daughter's desire. Right before our daughter went to high school, Mira took her to the front steps of her high school, and they prayed over that school and prayed for an open door. And she prayed and claimed that campus for God, and she got involved in a ministry that was there, and it began to thrive. And she was part of a high school parachurch ministry that brought in an evangelist that came in, and over, I would say, like 150 students came for the Chick-fil-A, but that's okay, right? They came, ate the Chick-fil-A, felt some persecution from some staff, and in that, I think 15, 20 kids gave their life to the Lord. And amazingly, the vice principal, who is a Christian, said, we have never seen this in the 30 years that I've been in the U.S. San Francisco School District. First time that we have seen an outright Christian outreach like this on the campus. And so God answered the prayer, right? God fought for her. Maybe he honored my heart as a father, right? You idiot, right? I will fight this battle for you, right? And so God, he does fight for us, amen? And he will fight for our children. Now, knowing that God is on our side is a wonderful thing. But there is a flip side to this, and that's the fact that sometimes it can feel like God is not for us. Right? Have you guys ever felt that? Like, God, I feel like you're not for me. And in fact, it can feel like our lives are at odds with God. And, in the greater context of Deuteronomy, the nation of Israel had forgotten how God had fought for them. And now they were faced with the consequence of some of those decisions. And on the cusp of entering into the land that was promised to them by God, they saw these opposing armies that they would have to overcome and that they would have to fight against. And they forgot, right? They forgot this God who fights for them. And it was, seen in their attitude, their behavior, their lack of faith, their lack of courage. And I think part of the problem here is that we're not accustomed to thinking, that God at times can be, or it may feel like he is against us. But the Bible is actually very clear that there are certain conditions of the human heart where God is categorically opposed to. In 1 Peter 1:5, we read this, that clothe yourselves with humility towards one another because God, what? Opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. That there is an opposition to our pride, right? And so in those moments, though God is, I would say for us at all times, in this moment, like as parents, we're sometimes opposed to our kids. He stands against us in that. James 4:4, we read this, that friendship with the world is enmity with God. Whoever loves the world as a friend, right? God will stand against that. And so we do need to check ourselves to see if we're driven by the things that drive the world, whether it's status, wealth, materials, pleasure, ambition, selfish ambition. Ambition, I think, is okay, but selfish ambition, and that list goes on. And in that, God will stand against you. Not out of hate, actually, but out of love, right? Now, I think that's the thing, right? Out of love, he will stand against you. We'll talk about his discipline a little bit more. And as he stands opposed, what he's actually doing is he's guiding you, right? He's leading you, which is the second portion. And so, is God for us or not? It depends. Does he fight for us? Is he opposed to us? The answer is extremely complicated. And it's here we see the importance of a biblically balanced view of God's guidance. And in the desert, God led his people with the cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. And on the top of Mount Sinai, he gave them the law. But unfortunately, like all children, especially when they become teenagers, they ignored the guidance that God provided, and they began to test the Lord. How many parents have seen your children test you? They test you, don't they? Right? That's what you get for testing God. That is for you to experience the heart of God, right? That's what it feels like, right? And so, like all children, they tested the Lord. And in those moments, we do see how God dealt with sin, both with grace and truth, the two hand in hand. And the world, and I think even parenting methods, move from one extreme to the other. But the scriptures reveal a God who always disciplines his children out of a place of love, right? Out of love, he disciplines us. Proverbs 3:12 says, "For the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights." And in the same way, one of the primary ways that we can guide our children is to discipline our children out of love for them, right? To not withhold that. As God's children, and for some of us as parents, I think we have to understand discipline in two ways. Very important for us. First, the usual way is correction for harmful behavior or sinful behavior, right? And that's usually, the way that we think of discipline. But there's a second, which is preparation for life, actually. That in discipline, right, it is preparation for life. And talk about the first point, what should discipline for harmful behavior look like? Well, it applies for both. But first, 4 C words, discipline needs to be controlled, okay? Just as God is slow to anger with us, we must be slow to anger with our children and avoid disciplining our children from that place of anger. Why? Because the anger of man, it does not lead to the righteousness of God. You can never lead anyone, actually, to God's righteousness, to living, in the righteousness of God with anger. It never happens. It makes people resentful, actually, right? It makes them bitter in their hearts. And so be slow. It doesn't say don't be angry, right? I think you have a right to be angry when your children are sinning and sinning against you, right? But just as God controls it and tempers his discipline, also we ought to do that as well. And that goes for all relationships that have these power dynamics. Second, discipline should be consistent. We cannot discipline our children for one thing one day, turn a blind eye the next time it happens, right, because we're tired. There is a steadiness to parenting that brings about a clear understanding of right and wrong in children, right? It has to be modeled, and it has to be consistent in your life as well, right? You can't tell them what you're doing is wrong, when I do it, it's fine, right? And I think that goes for the phone, right? I think that's something we all struggle with, right? You have to be consistent in action, right? And so very difficult for us to do, and we're not perfect, but it's, the standard that God sets before us. Discipline should always be compassionate. There's this old adage that, when we have to discipline our kids, it should hurt us more than it hurts them. Yeah, it doesn't always happen that way, right? Unfortunately, right? Sometimes I want to hurt you more than this hurts me. But that's, right, again, that's, what you're going after, right? You set that standard. And it should be with a heavy heart, right? A deep and heavy heart we should discipline our children out of compassion. We also should forgive and show as much grace as God has shown to us. And fourth, discipline should have its appropriate consequences. It should be with the appropriate amount. Small mistakes should have minor consequences, while more major transgressions should have more severe consequences. The punishment, so to speak, should fit the crime as well. So they understand, again, right, the spectrum. And consequences for bad behavior are things that parents should talk about with one another to make sure that it's level set. They're appropriate, and they're doing essentially the same thing. And we know this, right? We know this is I think, common knowledge, and that despite many of our sins, God continues, right, to love us, to carry us. And I think, in terms of preparation for life, this is something Mira actually does so well, right? Preparing our children for life. And using discipline for that, but what is that? We're disciplining our kids as preparation for life. Right? We're preparing them for life. That life isn't always easy, right? That people struggle, right? And sometimes you have to do what you don't want to do. And these are things, that also God does for us as well. That He places us and puts us in situations where, God, I don't want to be in this. But He allows us to go through them. And in the midst of that, right, He carries us when we can't go any further. And I think, that's what a good father would do, right? That's what He does for each and every one of us. And in this world, a parent's love for their children is the closest thing that mimics the love of God for us. And even then, it's not that particularly close. And as your own children cannot fully comprehend your love for them, so it is with us and the love of our Father. J.I. Packer, in his classic book, Knowing God, he states that the greatest benefit won on the cross was not salvation, but rather the privilege of adoption into the family of God. That salvation was the stepping stone into, right, the fatherhood of God, actually. And I thought about that, and it's true, right? Saving us doesn't mean that He had to make us His sons and daughters, His children. That was not a necessary next step. But God took that necessary step, and He said, you will be my sons and daughters, with the full rights of my only son, with the full inheritance, the full promises. All of that will be for you. And the unconditional love of God is predicated on this relationship between father and son. And this is why He cannot forsake us nor leave us. He cannot abandon us, right? And believe it or not, the angels of heaven don't have this guarantee. It's reserved for only you and I. And how do we begin to live into that? Because I know it's sometimes hard, right, to live into that. And when I think about my journey, these 30 years of being a Christian, I realize that it is that relationship with the Father that actually has carried me and renewed me. It wasn't just my strength, and I think that would be a falsehood if we left this place thinking, you know what, I just need to get renewed in my strength, and then I can do this. God just has to renew me. But there are times when you cannot walk anymore, when you cannot do these things, God says, let me carry you, right? Let me take you, right? And that's really the essence of the journey. And, I think of, When I think of Pastor Eddie, in the last stages of his life, I saw that. I saw his father and our father carrying him home. And it's incredible. And that's something I realized for myself as well when I was dealing with my health. I think it would be foolish to say, you know what, I buckled up, right, and I did this. No, he carried me, right, through that season. And it's the same for each and every one of us. And what allows us to lean into that is being able to say in our hearts and cry out, Abba, Father. And that's Galatians 4:6, isn't it? And because you are sons, because you are daughters, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, and thereby we can cry out, Abba, Father. Abba, Father. Right? Daddy. That Aramaic term of affection, intimacy, yet reverence, right? The worship that I describe here, that is what will carry. The Father that we worship reverently but intimately, right? Who we honor, but who draws us in. That's the Father that will carry us home, right? That will carry us through the most difficult seasons of our lives. In this passage, it talks about receiving the spirit of adoption that allows us to cry out, Abba, Father. And over the course of the years, I think, like many of us, I ebb and flow. But I began my walk with God when, the tenderness of God, this idea, the embrace and the warmth of God was something that was, I didn't think it was kind of trending at that time, if that's the word. And it was the old Vineyard songs like, Father, I want you to hold me, Arms of My Father. All those songs were, like big during that time. And as a new believer, right, that's exactly what I needed because of my broken relationship with my own father, which ultimately was reconciled. But because of, kind of that gap between immigrant fathers and their children, that's what drew me into the Christian faith. And that's what healed me. That's what strengthened me. That's what really, made me want to live this life for Him. But yet, I think what's happened is that, as we've kind of grown out of that immigrant stage, and, most of us are decent, good fathers, right? We've learned how to deal with their emotions, and there's no outbursts. I think we have kind of forgotten about that aspect of the Father. He's good, yes, right? But that tenderness, that drawing in, the feeling of safety in His arms, right? That's something we don't talk about as much. But it's here, amen? It's here. And it's, I believe, the answer to our fears, the answer to our anxieties, the answer to our insecurities. Just being able to say, Abba, Father, Daddy, would you hold me again, right? Would you carry me, right? Because I can't walk right now, right? I can't walk, let alone fly. But in this moment, I need you to hold me. And the word daddy describes God, our relationship with God, so deeply, the word Abba, actually. And the word Abba is used by Jesus in His most desperate time of need, if you remember. In the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark 14:36, in His moment of crisis, when He needed to put His full trust in His Father, He cried out, Abba, Father. Abba, Father. If it's your will, could you take me from this moment? And we know that we have been adopted simply by the conviction of the Spirit in our lives. And the Spirit, it testifies with our own spirit. And this morning, I just want to ask you this question. When's the last time you felt that? Right? That deep dependence, that deep intimacy, that deep love for your Father in heaven. And many years ago, just end with this, I had an amazing dream, a vision from God, in which God the Father was there, the Son, and God the Spirit, and they were looking at me through a window of an orphanage, and I was a mess. I could see myself, and obviously I didn't get a picture of God, but just a distinct sense that there were these three very personal, loving entities. And they were looking at me, sitting in the middle of the room, just in tears, feeling alone and abandoned. And the Father, I could hear him say, looks like there's a lot of work to be done here. A lot of work. And the Son, right, interceding and saying, yeah, but he would make a great addition to this family. And the Spirit, right, the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of the Father saying, I would love to hold him and comfort him. And for a person who largely grew up with a father who, was absent and unavailable emotionally, that wrecked me, right? That drew me in. And I came to the understanding and conviction that God is my true Father in heaven, that he's the Father that we all need, and that he is indeed the Father to the fatherless. And his Spirit on that day, during that vision, made full testimony to my own spirit. And I was able to cry out, Abba, Father. And that's the cry that I've been coming back to over and over again as I've needed strength to walk through this life. And I believe it will be the cry I will say on my last day, Abba, Father, I'm ready, right? And so, with that, can we just come to the Lord in prayer? And that deep conviction of God as our Father, right? So that we might be made like him as well. Let's pray.